They did not speak when they left her, not a word, not a glance, as if silence could make the choice lighter, as if turning their backs would turn her into something less than what she had been. And the wind carried the dust in long, low trails across the red Arizona earth, while Nayeli lay where they had set her down, one leg gone, the other stretched stiff against the ground, her breath slow, controlled, not from weakness but from something older than pain, something learned in years of standing where others would fall. The sun had not yet reached its highest point, but already the heat pressed down like a hand, heavy and patient, and still she did not call after them, did not ask why, because she already knew. She had seen it in their eyes long before the council spoke. That quiet shift when respect turns into calculation, when strength is no longer measured by what you've done, but by what you can still give. And somewhere behind her, fading with every heartbeat, were the hoofprints of the tribe that once rode beside her. The same people who had once followed her into battle, who had once trusted her to lead them through fire and dust and long nights without water, now reduced to shapes on the horizon, shrinking until even memories struggled to hold them. Around her neck the warm metal rested against her skin, bone-carved smooth and worn by years, a symbol not of pride but of duty, a reminder of the day she stood between her people and a storm that would have taken everything, and she closed her fingers around it now, not for comfort, but to feel something real, something that had not changed. The desert stretched wide in every direction, miles of nothing but sand and stone, and the quiet hum of heat rising. And in that silence, time slowed, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. Each second a choice, each breath a decision to remain, to endure, to wait, and far beyond the ridge, where the land dipped into shadow and rose again into light, alone. Ryder moved against the horizon, small at first, almost lost in the shimmer of distance, but steady, always steady. Ethan Cole had been riding since dawn, following a trail that made no sense, not the clean lines of cattle or the scattered prints of wild horses, but something uneven, something dragged, something wrong, and he could feel it before he fully saw it. That quiet weight in the air that told him this was not a place meant to be passed by without question. His horse slowed without command, ears forward, catching the same unease, and Ethan leaned slightly in the saddle, eyes tracing the marks across the ground, a line that cut through the desert like a scar. Deliberate, human, and alone, he dismounted without haste, boots meeting the dust with a soft crunch, the leather of his gloves creaking as he crouched, running his fingers just above the surface, not touching, just reading. And there it was, clear as truth. Someone had been left here, not fallen, not lost, but placed, abandoned to the sun and the slow turning of the sky. He stood then, lifting his gaze, and followed the line to where it ended, where she lay against the earth as if the desert itself had decided to keep her. And for a moment, neither moved, not him, not her, the distance between them filled with everything that had already happened and everything that might follow. Her eyes were sharp despite the heat, fixed on him with a clarity that cut through the shimmer, and her hand moved, slow but certain, reaching for the knife at her side, not as a threat, but as a statement, a line drawn even here, even now. Ethan saw it, and stopped where he stood, not reaching for his gun, not raising his voice, just watching, measuring, understanding more than he let on. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather and sun-warmed dust between them, and he took one step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the details, the worn edges of the metal, the set of her jaw, the strength that had not left her even when everything else had been taken. And he knelt, slow, deliberate, placing his hands where she could see them, offering nothing but presence. And for a long moment, the world held its breath, waiting to see which way it would turn. The knife did not tremble in her hand. Even now, even with the sun pressing down and the dry wind stealing what little strength the body tried to keep, Nayeli held it steady, not raised, not thrown, just there between them like a quiet line drawn in dust. And Ethan saw it for what it was, not a threat but a boundary, the last thing she still owned in a world that had already taken too much. So he did not move closer, did not reach for anything. He simply lowered his gaze for a moment in something that was not submission and not weakness but respect, the kind his mother once told him could speak louder than any words a man could say. And when he looked, Back at her, his hands were empty, open, visible, the canteen hanging loose at his side, catching a glint of sunlight as it swayed. He unscrewed the cap slowly, letting the small sound carry in the still air, then set it down within her reach and stepped back, not turning his back, never that, but giving her space as if the desert itself had taught him how to move without pressing, without taking, and for a long second she did nothing, her eyes fixed on him, measuring, searching for something that might betray him, some flicker of intention that did not belong. But there was none, only the steady quiet of a man who had learned to wait. And finally her hand shifted, not toward the knife this time, but toward the canteen, her fingers brushing the worn metal as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. She lifted it, took a small sip, then another, careful, controlled, never greedy, and Ethan noticed that. Noticed the discipline even in thirst, the way she did not let need take control, and something in his chest tightened. Not pity, never pity, but recognition, the kind that comes when you see someone standing in a place you understand all too well. The wind picked up then, carrying a low whisper across the open land, and he glanced toward the horizon, scanning the distance out of habit more than fear, but habit had kept him alive longer than most men he had known, and when he looked back, she was watching him differently now, the knife still in her hand, but lowered slightly, her shoulders no longer drawn tight with the same edge as before, and for the first time, her voice broke the silence, low, steady, each word chosen like it carried weight beyond itself. "You should go," she said, not as a warning but as a fact, and Ethan shook his head once, slow, almost absent, as if the answer had already been decided before he ever stepped into this moment. He did not ask why, did not ask who had left her or what had brought her here, because questions had a way of turning into judgments, and he had long since stopped believing he had the right to make either. Instead, he glanced down at her leg, at the careful way it had been wrapped, the makeshift bindings holding where something more permanent should have been, and he crouched again, moving only after her eyes met his and did not refuse. His hands worked quietly, adjusting the straps, tightening what had loosened, using a length of leather from his own saddle to reinforce what time and travel had worn thin. He said nothing while he worked, and she said nothing in return, but the silence between them shifted, no longer sharp, no longer guarded in the same way. It became something else, something that held a fragile kind of understanding. And when he finished, he sat back on his heels, dust settling around him. And for a moment, they simply remained there, two people in the middle of a land that belonged to neither of them, sharing nothing but the space and the stillness, until the sun began its slow descent and the light softened, stretching shadows long across the ground. Ethan rose then and moved to his horse. Retrieving a small blanket rolled tight behind the saddle, he brought it back and set it beside her without ceremony, then stepped away again, giving her the same distance he had before, and as the first hint of evening crept into the air, cooling what the day had burned, Nayeli pulled the blanket around her shoulders, her fingers brushing once more against the bone metal at her neck, and her gaze drifted past Ethan to the far line of the horizon where the land dipped and rose again. And though the distance looked empty, there was something there. Something only she seemed to sense at first, a change too subtle for the eye, but not for the instinct that had kept her alive through more than one battle. And a moment later Ethan felt it too. Not a sound, not yet, but a shift in the silence, a weight pressing just beyond what could be seen. And his hand moved, not to his gun, but to the reins of his horse, steadying it as the animal lifted its head and stilled, ears forward, listening to something that had not yet reached them. And in that quiet space between day and night, both of them understood without needing to speak that whatever had been left behind in the dust was not finished. Not yet. The first sound came like a memory, faint and uncertain, a low rhythm carried through the cooling air, and Ethan did not turn his head right away because men who survive the open land learn not to chase every whisper. They learn to listen first, to let the world reveal itself in its own time. But his horse shifted beneath the reins, muscles tightening, breath slowing, and that was enough. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the horizon where the last light of the sun stretched thin across the ridgeline, and there it was. Not yet shapes, not yet figures, but movement, distant, steady, deliberate, and beside him Nayeli had already seen it. her posture unchanged, yet her gaze sharpened, focused beyond the present moment into something deeper, something that spoke of recognition rather than surprise. And her hand moved to the bone metal at her neck, not clutching it, not hiding it, just resting there as if it anchored her to something that could not be taken. Ethan noticed that too. The way she did not reach for the knife this time, did not prepare for a fight in the way most would. Instead, she watched, waiting, and the wind shifted again, bringing with it the faintest echo of hooves, measured, controlled, not the reckless charge of men chasing fear, but the quiet approach of those who already knew where they were going. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing along the neck of his horse in a calming gesture, though it was unclear whether the animal needed it or if he did. And without looking at her, he spoke, his voice low. Even, how many? The question was simple, stripped of anything unnecessary, and for a moment she did not answer, her eyes still fixed on the horizon, as if counting something invisible to him. Then she spoke, just as quiet enough, and there was something in the way she said it that carried more truth than any number could hold. Ethan nodded once, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough. The desert did not lie, and neither did the people shaped by it. He moved then, not in haste but with purpose, adjusting the saddle, checking the straps, small motions that filled the silence without breaking it. And when he turned back, she was watching him again, not with suspicion this time, but with something more complex, something that held a question she had not yet asked. "You do not leave," she said, and it was not disbelief, not quite, but close enough to it to matter. Ethan met her gaze, steady as before. "No," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no reason given, just the truth as he carried it. And for a moment the world seemed to pause around them, the distance closing slowly as the riders drew nearer, shapes beginning to form where there had only been motion before, outlines against the fading light. And Naeli's eyes softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, a shift so small it might have been missed if not for the way she let out a breath she had been holding since before he arrived. "Then you do not understand," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only fact, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering her words as he might consider a trail that forked without warning. "Then tell me," he said, not as a demand but as an opening, and she looked away for the first time, her gaze dropping to the ground between them where the sand still held the marks of where she had been dragged, faint now, already beginning to fade. "They did not leave me because I am weak," she said, each word slow, deliberate, chosen with care. "They left me because I remember." Ethan did not interrupt, did not ask what she meant, he simply listened. The way a man listens when he knows the next words will matter more than anything he could say. She traced a line in the dust with her fingers, not writing yet, just marking the space as if preparing it. "There are things a tribe carries that are heavier than water, heavier than food," she continued, "and sometimes the only way to keep those things safe is to pretend they do not exist." Her hand stilled, and then she wrote, the letters rough but clear, shaped by habit more than practice. He read them as they formed, not quickly, not rushing to the end, but taking each one as it came. Secret. The words sat there between them, simple and heavy all at once, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but the weight of understanding that comes when a path closes behind you without sound. He looked up from the word to her face, and in her eyes he saw it then, not defeat, not even anger, but something steadier, something that had carried her this far and would carry her further if it could. "They will not ask," she said. "They will not explain," and Ethan nodded again, because he had seen enough of the world to know that truth often came without ceremony. The riders were closer now, close enough that the shapes had become men, the line of them stretching across the ridge like a shadow, cast by something larger than itself, and still they did not rush, did not shout. They simply approached, steady, inevitable, and Ethan took one step forward, placing himself not in front of her as a shield, not yet, but beside her, equal distance between them and what was coming, and the horse behind him stilled completely, as if the land itself had drawn a line and everything had agreed to respect it. The last light of the day slipped lower, painting the sky in muted gold and fading red, and, in that quiet, suspended moment, the distance between past and present narrowed to a single breath, and neither of them moved as the first of the riders reached the edge of shadow and stepped into the light. They did not stop when they saw her. Not at first. Not even when the last stretch of sunlight laid her clearly against the ground like something the desert itself had carved and forgotten. The riders moved in a single line, slow and measured, each horse stepping with the same quiet certainty, as if they followed a path already decided long before this moment. And Ethan watched them the way a man watches a storm rolling in across open land, not with panic, not with fear, but with the understanding that there is no arguing with what is coming, only choosing how you stand when it arrives. Beside him, Nayeli did not shift, did not reach for the knife again, her hand resting instead against the bone metal at her chest, her fingers still, almost calm, and that calm carried something heavier than defiance, something closer to acceptance, but not the kind that bends, the kind that holds. And when the first rider drew close enough for his face to be seen, there was no anger in his expression, no haste, only a stillness that felt older than the land beneath them. His eyes passed over Ethan first, not ignoring him but not settling there either, as if measuring a presence that did not belong yet refused to move. Then his gaze moved to Nayeli, and in that single shift something changed in the air, not louder, not sharper, just deeper, like the ground itself had taken a breath. The rest of the riders fanned out behind him, forming a wide arc, not closing in, not surrounding, just placing themselves where they needed to be, and no one spoke. Not yet. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft sounds of leather and the quiet exhale of horses that had traveled far without rushing. Ethan stood where he had chosen, neither stepping forward nor back, his hands loose at his sides, his posture steady, and he could feel the weight of their attention, not just from the man in front, but from all of them. A collective awareness that pressed without touching. And still he did not reach for his gun, because something in this moment told him it would not belong. Not here, not now. And Nayeli's voice came then, breaking the silence with a calm that did not ask permission. "You came back," she said, and it was not a question. The lead rider held her gaze for a long second before answering, his voice low, carrying across the space between them without strain. "We did not leave." And the words settled in the dust like something that had been waiting to be spoken. Ethan glanced at her, just once, and saw the smallest shift in her expression, not surprise, not quite, but recognition of something she had already begun to understand, and she shook her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the man before her. "You left enough," she said, and there was no anger in it, only truth, the kind that does not need to be raised to be heard. The man did not argue, did not defend. His gaze lowered briefly to the ground where the faint marks still traced the path she had been pulled across, then lifted again, and for the first time there was something in his eyes that was not just stillness, something that carried weight beyond the moment. "The secret must remain buried," he said, and the words hung there, simple and final, and Ethan felt them settle somewhere deeper than understanding, because he had seen that kind of choice before. The kind that asks for silence not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it would change everything. Nayeli's hand tightened slightly around the metal at her throat, and for a moment the wind picked up, lifting a thin veil of dust between them, softening the edges of everything. And when it cleared, she spoke again. Quieter now. "If it remains buried, then so do I." And that was the first crack, not in her voice, not in her posture, but in the space between what had been decided and what still remained possible. The riders behind the leader shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to show that the moment had weight for them too, that this was not a simple return, not a task completed, and Ethan stepped then, just one step, enough to place himself fully beside her, not in front, not behind, his presence aligning with hers in a way that needed no announcement, and every eye moved to him at once, not with hostility, not with challenge, but with the same measured attention they had given everything else. And he spoke, his voice steady, unhurried. "She stays," and the words did not rise, did not push. They simply existed, placed in the same way he had placed the canteen, the blanket, the quiet choices that had brought him here. The lead rider studied him for a long moment, the silence, stretching again. But this time it carried something different, something that shifted the balance in a way no one had planned. And when he finally spoke, it was not to challenge, not to threaten, but to Acknowledge, you do not know what you stand beside, he said, and Ethan met his gaze without flinching. Maybe not, he answered, but I know what I do. And in that exchange, something unseen moved, like a line drawn in the sand had been stepped across without force, without sound, and the sun slipped lower behind the ridge, leaving the land in a deeper shade of gold and shadow, and no one reached for a weapon, no one raised a voice. Because this was no longer a moment that belonged to action. It belonged to something else, something quieter, something that would decide itself not by who was strongest, but by who refused to step away. The air did not move for a long moment after his words settled, as if even the wind understood that something had shifted beyond what could be seen, and the riders remained where they were, not advancing, not retreating, their horses standing quiet beneath them like they had been taught to wait for more than command, to wait for meaning, and Ethan felt the weight of their stillness press in around him, not as a threat, but as a question that had not yet been asked out loud. And beside him, Nayeli did not lower her gaze, did not step back into the role they had chosen for her. She remained exactly where she was, her hand resting lightly against the bone metal, her shoulders straight despite everything that had been taken from her. And in that posture, there was something undeniable, something that did not belong to weakness or to abandonment, but to something older, something earned. The lead rider exhaled slowly, the sound barely there, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not authority, not command, but something closer to memory. You carry what should not be carried alone, he said, and Nayeli's eyes flickered just once, not away, but inward, as if the words had reached a place she had kept sealed even from herself. Ethan did not speak this time. He simply listened, the way a man listens when the ground beneath him begins to tell a story he cannot yet see. The riders behind the leader shifted again, not in tension, but in acknowledgement, subtle movements that spoke of agreement without a single word being exchanged, and the man continued, his gaze steady on Nayeli. The council chose silence, he said, because silence keeps peace, but peace built on forgetting does not hold. It breaks slowly, then all at once, and Ethan felt that truth settle in him like something familiar, something he had seen in towns that pretended not to see what was right in front of them, in men who chose comfort over truth until neither remained. Nayeli's fingers tightened slightly around the metal, and for the first time, her voice carried something beneath its calm, not anger, not fear, but weight. Then why did you leave me? She asked, and the question did not rise, did not accuse. It simply existed, placed between them like the words she had written in the dust before, and the man did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting past her for a moment, to the horizon where the last light had nearly disappeared. And when he looked back, there was no avoidance in his eyes, only truth, because you would not forget, he said, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, not lighter, because you would not lie. The wind moved again, soft, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, and in that quiet space the meaning unfolded without needing to be explained. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not breaking his stance, but grounding it, as if he understood now that this moment was no longer about standing against something, but standing with it. Nayeli's gaze did not waver, but something in her expression changed, not a softening, not surrender, but a recognition of the line she had been forced to walk, the line between truth and belonging. And she looked down then, just once, at the word still faintly marked in the dust, secret, already beginning to blur as the wind touched it, and she reached forward, not to erase it, not to protect it, but to press her hand over it, flattening it into the earth until it disappeared completely. And when she lifted her hand, there was nothing there, no trace of the word, only smooth sand like it had never been written at all. She looked up again, meeting the gaze of the man before her. If it must remain buried, she said, then it remains buried with all of us. And the words carried something new, not defiance, not refusal, but choice, her choice, not the council's, not the tribe's, and that difference mattered more than anything that had come before. The riders behind the leader lowered their heads slightly, not in submission, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, and the man held her gaze for a long moment before he nodded, once, slow, deliberate, as if marking the end of something and the beginning of something else. Then you return, he said, and it was not an order, not even a request. It was an opening, and Ethan felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, the line that had been drawn no longer separating, but connecting. He glanced at Naeli, not to decide for her, not to guide, but to witness, and she did not look at him right away, her eyes still on the man who had once been part of the same circle she had stood within. And for a moment the desert held its breath again, waiting, as it always did, for the choice that would shape what came next. And when she finally moved, it was not toward the tribe, not yet, but toward the space between them, placing herself where both paths could still be seen, her hand leaving the metal at her neck, her fingers open at her side. And in that small, quiet motion, everything changed, not with sound, not with force, but with the simple truth that she was no longer the one left behind. And no one spoke as the last light of day slipped fully beyond the horizon, leaving them all standing in the kind of silence that does not end something, but begins at. The night did not fall all at once. It settled slowly, like a decision made without words, the last color draining from the sky until only a thin line of pale light held on at the horizon. And in that fading glow the distance between them seemed both closer and farther than before. Naeli stood where she had placed herself, not claimed by either side, not abandoned anymore, but not returned either. And that space she occupied carried more weight than any position of power ever could. Ethan remained beside her, not moving forward, not stepping back, his presence steady in a way that did not demand anything yet refused to disappear. And the riders did not break their formation, though something in their stillness had changed, a quiet shift that spoke of uncertainty where certainty had once ruled. The lead rider studied Naeli for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of who she had been and who she had become. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, not weaker, but carrying something that had not been there before. You stand between two paths now, he said. And the words did not instruct, did not guide, they simply named what already existed. Naeli did not answer immediately, her gaze lifting toward the sky where the first stars had begun to appear, faint but steady. And for a moment she seemed to listen to something beyond the men, beyond the land, something quieter than both. Then her eyes lowered again, returning not to the rider, but to Ethan, and in that look there was no question, no request, only acknowledgement, as if she had already seen the answer reflected in the way he had stood beside her, without asking what it would cost. And Ethan met her gaze the same way he had met everything else, without hesitation, without promise, just the truth of where he stood, and that was enough. She turned then, slowly, facing the riders once more, her shoulders straight, her voice calm. I do not stand between, she said. I choose where I stand. And the words carried no anger, no resistance, only clarity, the kind that leaves no room for anything else. The riders behind the leader shifted again, not in tension, but in something closer to respect, subtle but unmistakable. And the lead rider inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the silence that followed it. Then you choose without fear, he said. And Naeli's expression did not change, but her answer came without pause. Fear does not decide for me. And the wind moved again, stronger this time, lifting the edge of Ethan's coat, brushing against the horses, carrying the scent of night across the open land. And in that moment something unseen settled among them. Not agreement, not resolution, but acceptance of something that had already begun to take shape. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not breaking his stance, but grounding it further. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, he spoke again, his voice low but clear in the quiet. She is not something to be decided, he said, and the words did not challenge, did not provoke. They simply existed alongside everything else that had been said. And the lead rider looked at him, really looked this time, not as an outsider, not as a presence to be measured, but as a man who had placed himself inside something that did not belong to him and had not stepped away. And after a long moment, the rider nodded once more, slower this time, as if the meaning carried further than before. Then she decides, he said, and it was no longer a question, no longer even an opening. It was a recognition. Naeli's hand moved once more to the metal at her neck, her fingers brushing over its surface, feeling the grooves carved by hands long gone. And she closed her eyes briefly, not in doubt, not in hesitation, but in memory, and when she opened them again, they were steady, clear. She reached up then, slowly, and lifted the cord over her head, the metal resting in her palm. And for a moment she held it there, between herself and the riders, between the past and what came next, and Ethan watched without moving. Understanding without needing it explained that this small object carried more weight than anything else in that moment. Nayeli stepped forward then, just one step, into the space that had once separated them, and she extended her hand, not offering the metal to the rider, not giving it back, but holding it where it could be seen by all of them. "This does not belong to silence," she said, her voice steady. "It belongs to truth." The words settled into the night air, and no one moved to take the metal, no one reached for it. Because the meaning was not in possession, it was in what had been acknowledged. The riders lowered their heads again, deeper this time, not in submission, not in defeat, but in something that carried both regret and respect. And the lead rider spoke one last time, his voice quieter than before. "Then the truth walks with you," he said, and Nayeli lowered her hand, the metal still in her grasp. And for the first time since they had arrived, the riders began to turn, not all at once, not in haste, but one by one, their horses shifting, their bodies angling away from the center of the moment, until the line that had once approached now began to recede, not as something defeated, but as something changed. And Ethan watched them go, the same way he had watched them arrive, without judgment, without assumption, until the sound of hooves faded into the distance and the night fully claimed the land. And when the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, the silence returned, deeper than before, but no longer heavy. And Nayeli stood there, the metal in her hand, the desert stretching wide around them. And for the first time since he had found her, there was no sense of something unfinished, only the quiet understanding that what came next would not be decided by what had been left behind, but by what they chose to carry forward together. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned, like something had been set down after being carried too far for too long, and the desert breathed again in its slow, patient way, the wind moving softer now, tracing the ground where the riders had passed, and smoothing their tracks until only memory held them. Ethan stood where he was for a long moment, watching the ridge long after the last shape had disappeared, not because he expected them to return, but because some habits were not about expectation, they were about respect. And when he finally turned back, Nayeli had not moved far, but something in her had. The weight in her shoulders was different, not gone, but no longer pressing downward, more like something she had chosen to carry instead of something forced upon her. The metal still rested in her hand, the cord loose between her fingers, catching faint light from the rising moon. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said about what had just passed, and words would only make it smaller. The horse shifted quietly behind Ethan, lowering its head, returning to the rhythm of a night that did not hurry, and Ethan reached for the reins, his movements unforced, then glanced at Nayeli, not asking, not offering, just acknowledging the space that now existed between them as something shared rather than divided. She looked down at the metal again, turning it slowly in her hand, feeling its edges, its history, and for a brief second her expression softened, not in weakness, but in memory, the kind that does not ask permission before it returns. Then she closed her fingers around it and tied the cord again, not around her neck this time, but around her wrist, firm, deliberate. And when she looked up, her eyes were clear, the past still there, but no longer behind her, no longer ahead of her either, just present, carried. Ethan noticed that, the change in where she placed it, and something in him understood without needing to ask. "You do not wear it the same way," he said quietly, and she shook her head once, a small motion. "It is not the same thing anymore," she answered, and the truth of that settled between them without weight, only meaning. The night deepened around them, the stars spreading wider across the sky, sharp and steady, and the air cooled enough that the heat of the day felt like something distant, something that had happened to someone else. Ethan moved to his saddle and pulled free a small bedroll, setting it down near where she stood, not too close, not too far, just within reach. Then he took a step back again, giving her the same space he had always given, and she lowered herself carefully onto the ground, not with struggle, not with hesitation, but with the kind of control that comes from knowing exactly what your body can do and what it cannot. And she sat there, looking out across the open land, her hand resting on her knee, the cord wrapped around her wrist catching faint light as she moved. After a while she spoke, her voice quieter now, not guarded, just calm. "Where will you go?" And Ethan did not answer right away. He looked out in the same direction she did, as if the land might offer something. Clearer than any word. Then he shrugged slightly. The motion simple, wherever the trail leads, and she nodded once, as if that was the only answer that made sense. And for a moment the silence returned, but this time it was different, not heavy, not waiting, just present, like the space between two people who no longer need to measure each other. "You can stay," she said then, not as an invitation, not quite, but as a statement of fact, and Ethan let out a slow breath, not relief, not surprise, just acknowledgement. "I was planning to," he said, and the faintest hint of something passed between them, not quite a smile, not quite anything that needed a name, just a shift that made the night feel less wide, less empty, and the wind moved again, carrying with it the distant sound of something small, an owl, maybe, or just the land settling into itself. And Ethan sat down a few feet away, his back to a low rise of earth, his hat tilted forward just enough to shadow his eyes, not hiding, just resting. And for a long time they stayed like that, two figures in a place that did not belong to either of them, and yet held them both without question, the kind of place where things could begin without needing to announce themselves. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the distance between what had been and what would come next no longer felt like something to cross. It felt like something already behind them. And the night carried on, steady and quiet, as if it had always been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. The night stretched long and unbroken, the kind of quiet that did not press against the ears but settled into the bones, steady and patient. And sometime before dawn, the air shifted again, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of distant water or maybe just the memory of it. And Ethan opened his eyes without moving, the habit of years bringing him back to awareness before the world had fully turned. Beside him Nayeli was already awake, not restless, not alert in the way of danger, but simply present, as if sleep had been a choice she stepped out of rather than something that released her. The stars were fading one by one, retreating into a sky that softened, from black to deep blue, and the horizon began to glow with that thin line of pale light that always came before the sun claimed the day. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the morning did not ask for it. It asked only that they notice it, that they stand in it without trying to shape it into something else. Ethan pushed himself up slowly, brushing the dust from his coat, his movements quiet, unhurried, and he moved to his horse, checking the saddle, the straps, the small things that made a long ride possible, not preparing to leave, just preparing, because that was what men like him did. They stayed ready even when they chose to remain. Nayeli watched him for a moment, her gaze following the rhythm of his actions. Then she shifted her weight, placing her hand against the ground to steady herself as she adjusted her position. And there was no strain in it, no hesitation, just the careful precision of someone who had learned her limits and made them her own. The cord around her wrist caught the early light, the bone metal resting against her skin like it belonged there now in a way it never had before. And when the first edge of the sun broke over the horizon, it did not rush. It unfolded slowly, painting the land in soft gold that stretched across the sand and stone, reaching them where they stood. And for a moment, everything felt still again, not empty, not waiting, just complete in itself. "You ride far," she said then, her voice low, carrying easily in the morning air. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, a faint line of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Sometimes," he answered, and she nodded, as if that was enough, as if distance did not matter as much as the choice to move through it. He stepped closer then, stopping a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to leave space between them. "There is a town about 15 miles east," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Water, supplies, people who mind their own business if you do the same." He did not offer it as a solution, did not suggest it as a direction she should take. He simply placed it there, like the canteen, like the blanket, something that existed without demand. Nayeli considered it, her eyes shifting briefly toward the horizon he had indicated, then back to him. I do not belong in towns, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just truth. And Ethan nodded. I figured, he replied, and for a moment they stood there, the light growing stronger around them, the day beginning to take shape. And then he reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He stepped forward and set it on the ground between them. Dried meat, a little bread, enough to last a few days if you stretch it, he said, then stepped back again, the same distance, the same quiet respect he had carried since the beginning. Nayeli looked at the bundle, then at him, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not surprise, not gratitude in the way most people showed it, but something steadier, something that understood the difference between being given something and being seen. You do this for all strangers, she asked, and Ethan shook his head once. No, he said, then after a brief pause, just the ones who do not ask for it. And the answer hung there, simple and unadorned, carrying more weight than anything longer could have. Nayeli lowered her gaze for a moment, then reached forward, picking up the bundle, her fingers closing around it with the same careful control she had shown with everything else. And when she looked up again, her eyes held his, steady, clear. You stayed, she said, and it was not a question, not even a statement meant to be answered, just something that needed to be acknowledged. Ethan met her gaze. I did, he replied, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them no longer uncertain, no longer defined by what had happened before, but by what they had chosen in its place. The sun rose higher, the light growing warmer, the shadows shortening as the day claimed its ground, and Ethan turned then, moving toward his horse, his hand resting briefly on the saddle before he swung himself up with an easy motion, settling into place like it was where he belonged. He looked down at her, not from above, not with distance, but with the same steady presence he had carried all along. I will be around, he said, not a promise, not a plan, just the truth as he saw it. And Nayeli nodded once, not asking where, not asking when. Because some things did not need to be fixed to a place or time to be real. She watched him for a moment as he gathered the reins, then turned her gaze back to the open land, the desert stretching wide in every direction, no longer something that had been left to take her, but something she stood within by choice. And when Ethan guided his horse forward, he did not ride away fast, did not disappear into the distance. He moved at a steady pace, the kind that could be followed if someone chose to. And behind him, Nayeli remained where she was, the medal at her wrist, the bundle in her hand, the morning light settling around her like something new, something not yet named. And as the space between them slowly widened, it did not feel like separation. It felt like a path, quiet and open, waiting to see who would walk it next. He did not look back right away, not because he did not want to, but because men who lived by the horizon understood that turning too soon could change the meaning of a departure. And Ethan let the distance grow between each step of his horse and the place where he had left her, the rhythm of hooves steady against the dry earth, the sun rising higher now, warming the air in slow layers, and behind him the desert stretched quiet, holding what had passed without trying to keep it. And for a while it felt like the world had settled into its usual shape again. One man riding, one path ahead, nothing owed, nothing expected, but then something shifted, not in the land, not in the sky, but in the space he carried inside him, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, that simply becomes too present to ignore. And he slowed his horse, not stopping, just enough to feel the moment more clearly, and he exhaled, long and quiet, before turning his head just slightly, not all the way, just enough to see the line of where he had come from. And there she was, still there, not smaller, not fading, but exactly as she had been, standing in the open, the light catching her outline, the metal at her wrist glinting faintly as she moved. And for a moment neither of them moved toward the other, the distance, holding steady like a question that had not yet been answered. And Ethan let his gaze rest there, not calling out, not raising a hand, just seeing. And then he turned forward again, guiding the horse a few more steps, giving the moment one last chance to pass without changing. But it did not pass. It stayed. And that was enough. He pulled the reins gently, bringing the horse to a stop, the leather creaking softly under his grip. And he sat there for a second, the sun warming his back, the wind brushing lightly across his face. And then he turned the horse around. Not fast, not dramatic, just a simple motion, the kind that does not ask permission, and he began to ride back, not toward a decision, but toward something that had already been made without words. And as the distance closed, Naeli did not step away, did not shift her stance. She remained where she was, watching him come with the same steady gaze she had held from the beginning. And when he reached her, he did not stop too. Close, he let the horse settle a few feet away, the space between them still respected, still chosen. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the return itself had already said what needed to be said. "You did not go far," she said finally, her voice carrying a quiet note that was not quite surprise, and Ethan shook his head once. "Not far enough," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that held more than distance, something that spoke of a path that no longer felt complete without turning back. Naeli studied him for a long second, her eyes moving over his face as if searching for something that might explain what words could not. Then she nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried understanding, not because she knew his reasons, but because she did not need to. And the wind moved again, lifting a thin veil of dust between them before settling back into stillness. And Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, his gaze drifting past her for a moment, taking in the open land around them, then returning to her. "There is a ridge about 2 miles north," he said, "a place where the ground holds water longer after the rains. It is quiet there. Not many riders pass through." He paused briefly, then added, "It is a good place to start." He did not say start what, did not define it, because some things lose their shape when spoken too clearly. Naeli followed his gaze in the direction he had indicated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she measured the distance in her mind. Then she looked back at him, and for the first time since he had found her, there was something in her expression that was not tied to what had been taken or what had been endured. It was something else, something that leaned forward instead of looking back. "You will show me," she said, not as a request, not as a demand, just as a statement of what came next. And Ethan nodded. Once, the same steady motion he had carried through everything. "I will," he replied, and he reached down, extending his hand, not pulling, not insisting, just offering. And she looked at it for a brief moment, then placed her hand in his, her grip firm, controlled, and with a single smooth motion he helped her onto the horse behind him, careful, precise, making sure her balance was set before releasing his hold. And when she settled, her hand rested lightly against the back of the saddle, the metal at her wrist brushing against the leather, catching the sunlight in a brief flicker. And Ethan adjusted the reins, his posture shifting slightly to account for her weight. Then he guided the horse forward, turning not toward the town he had mentioned before, but toward the north, toward the ridge, toward something that did not yet have a name. And as they rode, the desert did not seem as wide, not as empty, the distance ahead still long, still uncertain, but no longer something to cross alone. And behind them the place where everything had begun faded into the same quiet memory the land gave to all things, not erased, not forgotten, just carried differently, like a story that no longer needed to be told out loud to remain true. The rhythm of the horse settled into something steady and unhurried, each step pressing softly into the earth as the land stretched northward in long, quiet lines, and the sun climbed higher behind them, warming their backs without urgency, as if even the day understood that this journey was not meant to be rushed. Naeli sat balanced behind Ethan, her posture firm but relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the saddle, the other near her wrist where the cord lay wrapped, the bone metal shifting slightly with each movement, not heavy, not burdensome, just present, like a reminder that no longer demanded to be explained. And for a while they rode without speaking, the silence between them not empty, but filled with the small sounds of travel. Leather creaking, hooves pressing into dry ground, the distant call of something unseen carried on the wind. And Ethan kept his eyes on the horizon, not searching, not expecting, just following the line he had chosen, the ridge rising slowly ahead, a low break in the flat stretch of land, its shadow faint but growing as they approached. And after some time Naeli spoke, her voice calm, measured. "You do not ask what I remember." And Ethan did not turn his head, his gaze still forward. "No," he said, simply, and she was quiet for a moment. Then why? She asked, and this time he shifted slightly in the saddle, considering the question not as something to answer quickly, but as something to answer truthfully. Because it is yours, he said, and the words settled between them without weight, not dismissing, not avoiding, just placing the truth where it belonged. Nayeli's fingers moved slightly against the leather of the saddle, a small motion, thoughtful, and she looked past him toward the ridge, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as if measuring not the distance, but the meaning of the path they were on. Most men would ask, she said, not accusing, just stating. Ethan gave a slight nod. Most men want to understand everything, he replied. Then after a brief pause, I learned a long time ago that understanding is not always mine to have. The wind shifted again, carrying a warmer edge now as the sun rose higher, and the ridge came closer, its shape more defined, the ground beneath it darker. In patches where the soil held moisture longer than the open desert, and Nayeli let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something settles into place, not resolved, not finished, but accepted. And she spoke again, quieter now. There was a place, she said, her words slow, deliberate, as if each one had to be chosen carefully before it could be released, a valley beyond the mountains, where the water did not dry, where the elders kept what could not be spoken. Ethan listened without turning, without interrupting, his posture unchanged, but his attention fully there, and she continued. I was there when the council decided what must remain hidden. Her voice did not rise, did not fall. It stayed steady, carrying the weight without letting it take over. And Ethan felt something shift again, not in the world around them, but in the space between what he knew and what he did not need to know, and he nodded once, not to agree, not to confirm, but to show that he heard, and that was enough. Nayeli did not explain further, did not fill the silence with more detail, because she understood now that she did not need to, and that understanding changed something in the way she held herself. The ridge loomed closer now, its slope rising gently, dotted with sparse brush and patches of darker earth, and Ethan guided the horse slightly to the left, following a narrow path that wound upward at an easy angle, the kind of path that did not force the climb, but allowed it. And as they ascended, the air shifted again, cooler, carrying a faint trace of moisture that lingered just beneath the surface. And when they reached the top, the land opened on the other side, not wide, not endless, but contained, a shallow basin where the ground dipped and held what little water the season had offered. A small pool lay near the center, its surface still, reflecting the sky in a muted shimmer, and the grass around it was thin but alive, a quiet green against the red and brown of the desert. Ethan brought the horse to a stop, letting it stand as he took in the space. Then he glanced back at Nayeli. This is it, he said, and she looked out over the basin, her eyes moving slowly across the ground, taking in the shape of it, the way the land held itself. And for a moment she said nothing. Then she nodded, once. This will do, she said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before, not certainty, not finality, but the beginning of something that did not need to be named yet. Ethan dismounted first, landing lightly, then turned and offered his hand again, and she took it, the same firm grip, the same controlled movement as he helped her down, and when her feet met the ground, she did not hesitate. She stepped forward into the basin, her gaze fixed on the small pool, the metal at her wrist catching the light as she moved, and Ethan watched her for a moment, then led the horse to the edge of the water, loosening the reins to let it drink, the sound of it breaking the surface soft and steady, and the wind moved gently through the basin, carrying the faint scent of life where there had been only dust before. And as Nayeli stood at the edge of the water, her reflection faintly visible in its surface, she did not look away, she did not turn back, she simply stood there, present, grounded, as if for the first time the land was not something she had been left in, but something she had stepped into by choice. And behind her Ethan remained quiet, his presence steady, not shaping the moment, not claiming it, just there. As the sun rose higher and the day began to take hold of what they had found together, the water did not move much, only a slight ripple where the horse drank, the surface holding the sky in a quiet reflection that felt deeper than it should have been. And Nayeli stood at its edge, her shadow stretching into the shallow pool as if the land itself was learning her shape, She did not kneel right away, did not reach for the water like someone who had been denied it. Instead, she watched it, the way one watches something that has meaning beyond survival, something tied to memory, to place, to what remains when everything else is stripped away. And Ethan stayed where he was, a few steps back, giving the moment its space, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes moving once across the basin, noting the way the ground curved, the way the ridge shielded the wind just enough, the kind of details that told a man whether a place could hold more than a single night. And after a long moment, Nayeli lowered herself carefully, one hand steady against the earth, the other brushing lightly against the surface of the water, her fingers barely breaking it, just enough to feel the coolness. And she closed her eyes for a second, not in relief, not in gratitude, but in recognition, as if this simple touch confirmed something she had already begun to understand. And when she opened them again, she cupped a small amount of water in her hand and let it fall back, not drinking, not yet, just letting it return. And Ethan watched that, the restraint, the intention, the way she did not take more than what the moment required. And something in him settled a little further, the quiet certainty that this place was not just a stop, it was a beginning. The wind moved gently through the basin, brushing the thin grass, carrying the faint sound of distant life. And Nayeli finally leaned forward and drank, slow, controlled, not hurried, the water slipping from her hands to her lips, in small measures. And when she finished, she sat back, her gaze lifting to the ridge behind them, then to the open sky above. And for the first time since he had met her, there was no trace of the weight that had followed her across the desert, not gone, but changed, placed somewhere that no longer pressed against every breath. "You chose this place before you saw it," she said, her voice quiet but certain, and Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "I choose places like this," he answered. And she tilted her head slightly, studying him again, not with suspicion, not with caution, but with something closer to curiosity, and she nodded once. "It holds," she said, and the simplicity of her words carried more meaning than anything longer could have. Ethan stepped closer then, not too close, just enough to stand at the edge of the water beside her, his boots pressing into the damp soil, and he crouched, scooping a handful of water for himself, drinking in the same slow, measured way. And when he finished, he wiped his hand against his coat and looked out across the basin again. "It will not be easy," he said, not as a warning, not as a challenge, just as truth. And Nayeli did not look at him, her eyes still on the water. "Easy is not what I am looking for," she replied, and there was something in her voice that made the air feel steadier, as if the land itself recognized the kind of choice she had made. Ethan nodded once. "That makes two of us," he said, and the moment passed without needing to be held any longer. He stood, moving back toward the horse, checking its footing, loosening the saddle slightly to let it rest. And Nayeli shifted her position, turning away from the water, to face the basin itself, her eyes scanning the ground, the slope, the small details that would matter when the sun climbed higher and the night returned again. She moved then, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with purpose, crossing a few feet to a patch of ground where the earth was firmer, less worn, and she crouched again, her hand pressing into the soil, testing it, feeling its give. And she nodded slightly to herself, as if confirming something only she could see. "This will hold a fire," she said, and Ethan glanced over, a faint line of approval crossing his face. "Then that is where it starts," he answered, and she looked up at him, meeting his gaze, not asking, not needing to. And in that exchange something settled between them, not spoken, not defined, but understood, the kind of understanding that does not come from time, but from choice. And as the sun climbed higher, casting stronger light across the basin, the space began to change, not in shape, not in size, but in meaning. The ground no longer just ground, the water no longer just water. It became something else, something shaped by the presence of two people who had chosen to stand within it. And Ethan moved to gather a few dry branches from the edge of the ridge, bringing them back without comment, setting them down near where she had marked the ground. And Nayeli watched him for a moment, then reached for one of the pieces, turning it in her hand, measuring its weight, its balance, before placing it carefully where it would catch, where it would build. And they worked without speaking, not because they had nothing to say, but because the work itself carried what needed to be understood, and as the first small structure took shape between them, simple, deliberate, the basin no longer felt like a place they had found. It felt like a place they had begun, and the desert, wide and quiet beyond the ridge, did not press in the same way anymore. It waited, not as something to endure, but as something to walk into. One step at a time. The fire did not rise quickly. It began as a faint curl of smoke, thin and uncertain, drifting upward as if testing whether it belonged there. And Nayeli watched it the same way she had watched the water, not rushing it, not forcing it, her hands steady as she adjusted the small pieces of wood with careful precision. And Ethan sat nearby, one knee bent, his elbow resting loosely against it, observing without interfering, because he understood that some things were not meant to be helped, they were meant to be allowed. And the flame caught slowly, first a flicker, then a breath, then something that held, small but certain, and when it finally settled into a steady glow, it did not roar, it did not demand attention, it simply existed, and that was enough. The basin seemed to shift around it, the light from the fire mixing with the sun that still hung high, creating a space that felt marked, claimed not by ownership but by presence. And Nayeli leaned back slightly, her gaze resting on the flame, her expression unreadable but not distant, more like she was measuring something within herself against what she saw before her. And after a moment she spoke, her voice low, almost blending with the sound of the wind. "This is how it begins." And Ethan nodded once, not asking what she meant, because he understood that beginnings rarely announce themselves with certainty. They arrive quietly, like this, almost unnoticed until they are already in motion. And he reached for a small piece of wood, turning it in his hand before placing it gently onto the edge of the fire, not disrupting it, just feeding it enough to continue. The smoke rose straighter now, carried upward by air that had warmed just enough to lift it cleanly, and the scent of it spread lightly through the basin, not harsh, not heavy, just present, like a signal that something had changed. The horse stood a short distance away, head lowered, calm, as if even it recognized that this place held a different kind of stillness. And the wind moved through the ridge again, softer than before, brushing the edges of the fire without disturbing it, as if the land itself had decided to allow this small claim to remain. Nayeli shifted her position, turning slightly so that the light from the flame touched her face, her features steady, composed. And for the first time since the beginning of the journey, there was something in her presence that did not carry the weight of what had been left behind. It carried something else, something that looked forward without needing to push. "You did not bring me here," she said after a moment, her eyes still on the fire, and Ethan glanced at her, a faint line of understanding already in his expression. "No," he replied, and she nodded slightly. "You showed me where I could stand," she continued, and the distinction mattered. It settled into the space between them with quiet certainty. Ethan leaned back a little, resting both hands against the ground behind him, the heat of the fire reaching him in a steady warmth. "That is all a man can do sometimes," he said, not guiding, not claiming, just pointing to where the ground does not give way. And Nayeli's gaze lifted from the flame to him, not searching, not questioning, just meeting his presence as it was, and she held it there for a moment, then nodded once, as if something had aligned in a way that did not need further thought. The sun began to shift lower again, the arc of the day moving forward without pause, and the shadows in the basin grew longer, stretching across the ground in quiet lines that mirrored the path they had taken to reach this place. And Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dust from his hands, then moved toward the edge of the basin, scanning the ridge out of habit, not expecting anything, but always aware. And when he returned, Nayeli had already adjusted the fire slightly, the structure holding stronger now, the flame steady, no longer needing constant attention. It had found its balance, and he stopped a few feet away, watching her for a moment before speaking again. "The ridge will block most of the wind tonight," he said, and she nodded. "I saw that," she answered, her tone calm, certain, and there was something in that exchange that felt different from before, not instruction, not guidance, but shared understanding, the kind that grows without effort when two people begin to see the same things from where they stand. The fire crackled softly, a quiet sound that filled the spaces where words were no longer needed, and the light it cast grew warmer as the sun dipped lower, the basin holding both at once, day and fire, past and present, and Nayeli reached down, her fingers brushing the ground where the earth had been pressed by her earlier touch, and she smoothed it again, not erasing anything this time, but shaping it, making it even, as if preparing it for something that would come later, and Ethan watched that small motion, understanding without needing it spoken that she was not just settling into the space, she was beginning to shape it, to make it her own in a way that did not take from the land but moved with it, and the wind carried a faint sound from beyond the ridge, distant, barely there, but neither of them turned toward it, neither of them reacted, because whatever it was, it did not belong to this moment, and the moment held steady, grounded in the quiet fire, the open sky, the choice that had been made without force. And as the day began its slow turn toward evening once more, the basin did not feel like a place found by chance. It felt like a place that had been waiting, not for them specifically, but for the kind of presence they brought, the kind that did not try to own it, only to stand within it with honesty. And that was enough to make it hold. The evening settled slower this time, not like something ending, but like something choosing to stay, the light fading in layers across the basin, soft gold turning to amber, then to a quiet blue that wrapped around the ridge and held it in place, and the fire carried on without effort, its glow steady, its warmth enough. Nayeli sat near it, her posture relaxed but never careless, her hand resting against her wrist where the cord held the bone metal, and she turned it once between her fingers, not studying it anymore, not measuring what it meant, just feeling it as something that now belonged to her in a way it never had before. Ethan stood at the edge of the basin again, not because he expected anything to appear, but because watching the horizon had become less about guarding and more about understanding where you stood in it. And when he turned back, the light from the fire had already taken the place of the sun, shaping the space between them into something smaller, something held, and he walked back without a word, lowering himself onto the ground a few feet from her, the same distance, the same quiet respect, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the silence now carried no questions, no tension. It simply existed, like the fire, like the land, like the space they had made. And then Nayeli shifted slightly, her gaze lifting to the ridge where the last of the daylight had disappeared, and she spoke, her voice calm, almost thoughtful. "They will not return." And Ethan nodded once, not because he knew, but because he understood what she meant. Some paths do not turn back once they are left behind. "No," he said, "they will not." And the words settled without weight, not relief, not loss, just truth. The wind moved gently through the basin, brushing the fire without disturbing it, carrying the faint scent of ash and earth, and Nayeli leaned forward slightly, reaching for a small piece of wood and placing it onto the fire, with careful precision, the flame catching it without resistance, and she watched it for a second, then spoke again, quieter now. "My people chose silence to protect what they feared to lose," and Ethan listened, not turning, not interrupting, because he knew this was not something meant to be answered, only heard. And she continued, "I chose truth, not because it is stronger, but because I could not carry both." And the words did not rise, did not fall. They simply existed, placed with the same care she had given everything else. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something settles deeper than thought. "Most people never choose," he said after a moment. "They let the choice be made for them." And Nayeli nodded slightly, her gaze still on the fire. "I know," she replied, and the quiet between them returned, not empty, not waiting, just present, like something complete. The stars began to show again, faint at first, then clearer as the sky darkened, and the basin held their light along with the fire, small points above and below, and Ethan shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze drifting across the ground they had shaped, the fire, the water, the place where she had pressed the earth flat. And he spoke again, his voice low, steady. "This place will change." And Nayeli looked at him, not questioning, just listening. "People will pass, some will stay, some will not understand what it is." And he paused briefly, then added, "But it will hold as long as you do." And the words were not a burden, not a warning. They were simply the truth as he saw it. And Nayeli considered that, her eyes moving from him back to the fire, then to the water beyond, and she nodded once. "It will hold," she said, not as a promise, but as something already decided. The fire shifted slightly, a small crackle breaking the quiet, and the wind carried it upward, blending it into the night. And Ethan leaned back a little, his hands resting against the ground behind him, his posture easing in a way it had not before, not because he had let his guard down, but because he no longer needed to carry it in the same way. And for a while they sat like that, two figures in a place that no longer felt borrowed, the fire steady between them, the sky wide above, and the land holding everything without question. And after some time Naeli spoke again, her voice softer now, not distant, just settled. You did not stay because of me. And Ethan turned his head slightly, looking at her with that same steady gaze. No, he said. Then after a brief pause, I stayed because I saw where I could stand. And she held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, the understanding clear, unspoken. And the silence that followed was different again, not the silence of strangers, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of two people who had found something that did not need to be named to be real. The fire burned lower, not fading, just settling, and the stars above grew brighter, the night deepening around them, and the basin held steady, unchanged in shape, but changed in meaning. And as the last small piece of wood shifted into the flame and the light softened, neither of them moved to add more, neither of them spoke, because nothing more was needed. The moment had already become what it was meant to be, quiet, complete, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the world continued as it always did. But here, in this small held space, something had been set in place that did not depend on the world to remain, something that would last as long as it was carried, not in words, not in memory, but in the simple act of standing where it mattered. And the night moved on, slow and steady, holding them there in a silence that no longer needed to be broken.